experience here. We want to know what are the rules to be accepted by the dominant society? What are the rules to not experience racism in America? And every time we learn one rule, we're told those rules don't apply and there's another rule. When African Americans were first dropped off from the slave ships, we said, okay, what do we need to do to be accepted by the dominant society? We were told, well, if you change your name from those African names, we'll accept you then. So African people said, okay, we'll change our names. Can we be accepted? They said, well, no, not quite, because now you're using that voodoo and that African religion. If you take on our religion, then we'll accept you. So black people said, well, that's not a problem. I mean, we're familiar with Christianity because we have a version of that in Africa. The whole European Jesus thing, that's a new thing for us. But if you'll accept us and you'll lay off the racism, no problem. We'll be better Christians than you. Can we be accepted? The dominant society said, well, no, not quite, because now that African voodoo is still there, so maybe if you weren't so lazy, we'll accept you. So black people said, okay, well, we're slaves. Nobody works harder than a slave. We pick all this cotton, we do all this work. Nobody works harder than us. Can we be accepted? So the dominant society said, well, no, because now slavery is over and we don't need your work no more. So black people said, okay, well, how about hiring us since we have all the skills? The dominant society said, well, no, not quite, because we have white-only unions, so we don't need that. So African-American people said, okay, well, look, how about we just build our own communities? We'll build our Tulsa, Oklahomas, our Central Avenues in Los Angeles. We'll build our own prosperous communities, and we'll just leave you be. How about that? The dominant society said, well, no, you can't do that because now you're making a little more money than us and now you're becoming a threat, so we're gonna burn those little communities down. So black people said, okay, how about this? We'll work for you, just hire us, we'll keep our heads up, we'll have dignity, will you accept us? The dominant society said, well, no, because you're being uppity now. We don't want uppity black folks. So black people said, okay, well, how about this? We'll just shuck and jive, we'll be entertainment for you. We'll tap dance, skin and grin, coon, do whatever. Can we be accepted? The dominant society said, well, we love the entertainment part of you, but we can't really respect that, so we won't accept you. So black people said, well, we'll just drop out completely. We won't even try to be accepted by you. We'll just hang out on the corner. We won't even try to become part of the dominant society. We'll just hang out in front of the liquor store. If we see something we like, we'll take it. We'll just do our thing. The dominant society said, well, no, you do that, we're gonna arrest you. So black people said, okay, well, how about we just go in the house? We'll just get crumbs from you. We'll just stay in the house and watch TV because that way we can escape racism. But the thing is, when you look at television, what do you see? Negative image, negative image, negative image, negative image of African-American people. So the bottom line is there are no rules for the dominant society to accept black people as a whole. All the rules are there to keep you marginalized. And that brings us to rule number one. Keep people confused as to what racism is.
I became aware of racism as a kid was watching cartoons. And then, I mean, they have like, you know, cannibals cooking up people, and the way the illustration was, you know what I'm saying? It was like, wow, like Africans don't look like that.
Because racism is not a noun, it's a verb, it's an action. And in order for a person to practice racism or to be a racist, they have to not just have prejudice, they have to have power to influence the success or failure of another group's life. That's a racist, and we don't understand it. We think it's just not liking somebody.
Racism has to do with power. For example, a black person could stand on the corner and say every negative thing they could think of to say about a white person. They can't determine where the person lives, how much money the person is going to make, you know, whether they're going to have health care. So racism is a power dynamic. It is a power system dynamic. And black people are the victims of racism. Calling a person names is not the same as being able to control every aspect of that person's life.
Racism means to control somebody's faith and destiny. I can hate you because you're Jewish, I can hate you because you're Irish, I can hate you because you're German. That's prejudice.
America was founded on racism. There's no institution that can get away from the founding principles of its origin. America was founded on the oppression of African people, the enslavement of African people. In order for you to get away from that, you're going to have to reconstruct American society from the bottom up.
Well, if you are struggling for your genetic survival, then the threat to your genetic survival has to become a target. And the black male is perceived as the threat to white genetic survival. It's because only males, whether they're white, black, brown, red, or yellow, can impose sexual intercourse. Females cannot impose sexual intercourse. So if the male, and if the black male is perceived consciously and or subconsciously as the genetic threat, then he has to be attacked. And so this is what we see, whether it's unemployment, incarceration, failure in school, because there is war going on.
The cloak of Obama, under the illusion of inclusion, as I like to call it, black people are suffering more now than they did under both George Bush and Bill Clinton. Our unemployment rate is higher. Our incarceration rate is higher. Every index of so-called progress for blacks is worse under Obama than the 2-3 previous presidents. You always put a black face in office when you're about to take things back from black people.
But here's what they didn't hide. They said if you have 1 32nd Negro blood, you're a Negro. Now think about what they just told you. This is a cat who don't like me. He said if you have 1 32nd Negro blood in you, you know what that really means? In order to equal 1 Dick Gregory, you got to put 32 white boys next to me. Are you crazy?
Black people look at racism as a moral issue. And when you look at racism as a moral issue, especially for black people, you automatically relegate racism to the realm of religion. That's a problem, because now the solution to racism becomes baptizing or Islamicizing white people into the righteousness of God and equality. And the problem with that is that the church and the mosque, ironically, have been some of the biggest perpetrators of history of racism in global history. The Roman Catholic Church was one of the first institutions to actually give permission, okay, for African people to quote unquote be reduced to servitude.
To get someone to actually think that someone else is inferior, you have to raise that type of mentality to a religious level. And that's why racism essentially was given its validation through the church. And it is the church that gave it a divine presence in order to say that whatever atrocities you commit in the name of the church is justified because these people did something against God that warrants their punishment and their social status.
What makes it so hard to fight it is because it's invisible. When you go to court and you sue for discrimination, when you go to court and you sue for racial prejudice, I didn't get hired because I was black. I was kicked out of school because I was black. You have to prove racist intent on part of the perpetrator. So racism, as white supremacy's chief weapon, is difficult to combat it because you have to prove that the person who committed the act of racism had the deliberate intent of discriminating against you because of color. And because we are all humans, nobody's perfect. So there's a million reasons they can use as an excuse for why you didn't get hired. He didn't have enough experience, but you really didn't get hired because you were black. There's a million reasons they can use why you didn't get hired. He was overqualified. Now look at that. You talk about some reverse racism. You told me I couldn't get the job because I didn't have a college degree. I came back with a master's. Now you're telling me I'm overqualified. So now before I didn't get the job because I didn't have enough education, now I don't get the job because I got too much. So the problem with racism is that it can hide behind everyday human errors that all of us have.
Man, let's think about this. Here's what we do. Let's call the Africans black folk and the Europeans white folk. That's where that came from. Nobody in the world referred to themselves as white folks.
There were no people classified as white before the 15 and 1600s. As a matter of fact, the term Caucasian is a very relatively new term. It was a guy named Johann Blumenbach who came up with that term around 1790, 1795. So these are relatively new terms.